A man spilled a cup of hot coffee on a young black boy mid-flight. The boy, Marcus, sat there stunned, his hands shaking from the pain of the scalding liquid. The smell of burnt coffee filled the cabin, mixing with the stuffiness in the air. And before Marcus could even gather his wits, a flight attendant strode forward, her figure tall and straight, her eyes piercing as if she could see through the whole situation. Tyler, the flight attendant, stood straight, not saying a word. With just a steady gaze and steady steps towards the man, she silenced everyone in the cabin. That man was Eric, and now he had a strong feeling that things were not as simple as he thought. What happened next would be unbelievable. "You're not the one I need to worry about," Tyler said, his voice cold but authoritative. "The authorities will take care of that. You will answer for all the harassment you've done, all the rules you've broken, and I will make sure of it." Eric, the man now pale, his face red with anger, tried to fix his tie, his hands shaking as if he couldn't accept the situation. But deep down, he knew that this was getting out of hand. He had misjudged Tyler, and now he would pay the price. The atmosphere in the cabin was so tense it could have been cut. The silence stretched on until Eric, with a red face, muttered, "This is not over yet." Tyler didn't waver. "No, this is over for you." A deadly silence fell over the cabin, and every passenger felt the tension in the air. Eyes began to turn towards Eric, and then a passenger stood up. A software engineer from row 16 looked straight at Eric and said softly, "I saw this happen. That man did it on purpose." His words were like a bucket of cold water, causing all eyes to turn to row 14, where the tension had not yet subsided. Eric, who had been sitting firmly in his chair, was now struggling to regain his composure. The coffee that had spilled on Marcus was still simmering in the air, and the bitter smell of it, mixed with the heavy smell of jet fuel, made the tension palpable. Eric tried to smile, but his smile could not hide the panic that was beginning to creep into his every move. "It's not a problem," he said, his voice harsh and urgent, as if he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "It's just a little accident." However, things were not that simple. Every word Eric said seemed to admit that he had no control over the situation. Silence filled the air, the atmosphere was frozen as if time had stopped, but in contrast to that silence, whispers quickly spread throughout the cabin. A passenger sitting near the window in row 8 turned to his companion and whispered, "This isn't the first time he's done this. I saw him on another flight. This time it wasn't an accident either." Those words made the people around him even more alert. No one was surprised by Eric's behavior anymore. Everyone saw the problem, and they began to connect the dots, the memories that remained in each person's heart. If just one passenger stood up and spoke up, everything would become a chain of dominoes that could not be saved. Marcus felt the heat of the spilled coffee, but what frightened him most was the silence, the lack of justice he faced. Marcus was confused, but not because he felt blamed or slighted. He felt the pain, but instead of shrinking, he found strength within himself. Each drop of coffee on his skin seemed to be a symbol of the challenge he faced, and he would not give up. Tyler stepped forward, her posture erect, her gaze fixed on Eric. Each step she took seemed to answer the lies Eric had just told. She said nothing, just stood there, determined, and the air around her seemed to gravitate toward her. No one doubted the power she held, no one doubted the rightness of what she was about to do. Eric turned to her, a flash of anger in his eyes. But instead of confrontation, it was as if he realized that this was more than just a small argument, but an awakening. "I won't let this go," Eric muttered, anger in his voice. But as Tyler's eyes swept over her, cold and unwavering, Eric knew his life would never be the same again. Meanwhile, Marcus felt Tyler's protectiveness, and that feeling slowly pushed away his anxiety and fear. Tyler was no stranger. She was a strong and determined person who would not allow anyone, no matter who, to cross the line of respect and dignity. No one doubted that Tyler would do what was necessary to protect the innocent. But Marcus understood that it wasn't just him who had to fight, but everyone who witnessed this had a part in that battle. The tension in the air grew. The passengers began to turn to each other. Looks and whispers spread quickly. And it seemed like every eye in the cabin was on Eric, waiting for what would come next, as if everyone was aware that this would not end as easily as the previous ones. Inside the plane, everything was quiet, but the tension was like an undercurrent, quietly washing away everything. Tyler stepped forward, each step strong and determined, each one a statement that this was not the time to give in. Eyes were on her from all sides, each waiting silently for the event that would change not only this moment, but what they believed in about justice and righteousness. Tyler stood facing Eric, the distance between them stretched by the tension in the cabin. All the surrounding sounds seemed to stop, save for the heartbeats and breathing of those witnessing this encounter. Tyler's gaze was unwavering, cold and sharp as a knife. She didn't need to say much, she simply stared straight at Eric, her gaze filled with power and determination. "You cannot escape your responsibilities," she said, her voice low but loud enough for everyone around her to feel her unwavering determination. Each word cut through the suffocating air like a knife, the message clear, there was no room for evasion. Eric stood there, his hands shaking, his usually confident face pale. He swallowed, trying to appear calm, but anxiety was creeping into his eyes and then slowly spreading through his movements. He adjusted his tie, an awkward gesture, as if that would make things go back to normal. But Eric knew this couldn't be a small incident anymore. Tyler's words, coupled with the suspicious looks of the passengers, made him feel like he was standing before an irrefutable court. A passenger sitting near the back of the cabin stood up, and without a word, he said, "I saw it all, and I'm not letting him get away with it." Those words were like a fire, igniting small conversations in the cabin. People began to realize that this was not just an incident, but a change. The story of Eric and what he had done was no longer his story. It had become the story of everyone on this flight. And those passengers, they could not stand by and watch someone in power abuse this trust. Eric felt the change within himself. He began to realize that what he thought was a small action, a brief argument, had now become an inevitable confrontation. What had been a mere power play had now become a real challenge. Tyler's every word, her every action, was full of justice, like a cold stream of water pouring over Eric, making it impossible for him to escape the feeling of fear rising in his heart. Every step Tyler took was a reminder that Eric's actions could not be ignored. Everyone around him was looking at him, and no matter how much he tried to ignore it, no matter how much he tried to push the anxiety out of his mind, Eric couldn't help but feel the tension in the air. Those eyes, the whispers from the passengers, all of it painted a clear picture of an undeniable truth. Eric had messed up, and now he had to face the consequences. Tyler stood there, unwavering, a beacon of justice. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to make any big moves. It was clear. She was the only one who didn't fear, who wouldn't back down from oppression, and she was the one who would make Eric pay. The passengers around her waited for that moment, the moment when the truth would come to light, and justice would no longer be a distant concept. Part of Eric started to panic. He tried to stand firm, but the moment Tyler stood in front of him, everything seemed to spiral out of control. And then a sound broke the silence. A passenger stood up, not too loud, but enough to get everyone's attention. The man from row 16 stepped forward, his eyes resolute. "I saw the whole thing," he said, without hesitation. This man did it on purpose. It was not an accident. His voice did not tremble, but was very dignified, as if each word carried the weight of telling the truth. The words spread like fire throughout the cabin, that making the atmosphere even more tense. Scrutinizing glances began to turn to Eric, and some passengers exchanged whispers, then they turned to look at him, not hiding their contempt. Before Eric could react, a woman from row 14 stood up. Her coat was rumpled from the long flight, but her eyes were bright with determination. She looked straight at Eric, her voice low and sharp. "This isn't the first time," she said, her hands clenching slightly. "This man has a history. Not just once, but many times. The way he treats people, I can't stand by and watch." Her words echoed through the air like a gunshot, creating a noise that couldn't be ignored. And when she finished, the air seemed to stop for a moment. The people around her began to whisper, sharing what they had seen, their own stories that they had kept quiet for so long. Eric's story was no longer an individual incident, but a story that all the passengers felt. People sitting nearby began to stand up, each of them as part of a community that could no longer ignore injustice. With every word, every action, they had decided they would not ignore it. Their eyes looked at Eric not with fear, but with a clear truth, an unshakable solidarity. These passengers were no longer simply passengers on the flight. They were witnesses to justice, and they could no longer let wrongdoing go unnoticed. One by one, the passengers stood up, no longer looking at each other with suspicion or indifference. A sense of community was created, as everyone realized that silence was not the answer. Eric was no longer just a lone offender. He was the object of a collective outcry from everyone present. None of them wanted to see injustice go unnoticed anymore. And while the passengers came from different walks of life, they all shared a single purpose: to defend truth and justice. At this point, eyes were not only on Eric, but also on Tyler, who stood firm in the middle of the cabin. She was a symbol of determination, and it was the support from the passengers around her that made her feel like she was not alone in standing up for justice. They were all part of this story, and no one could turn their backs on what was happening. Eric was losing control now, the hot flashes of his anger starting to flare up. But when his eyes met Tyler's cold ones, a feeling of panic rose strongly. Tyler didn't move, didn't hesitate. Her hands were firmly placed on her hips as if she was preparing for a battle she knew she would win. Everything around her seemed to quiet down, leaving only the sound of tense breathing, suggesting the inevitability of the confrontation. Eric, who had not expected this resistance, now felt hemmed in. The small space seemed to shrink, making him a trapped animal. The passengers around him began to watch, no longer hiding their anger. And in the suffocating silence, Tyler took a step closer, her gaze unwavering, her voice powerful. "This is more than just a cup of coffee, Eric," she said, each word like a stone thrown into a still pond. "You will face the consequences." There was no mercy in the words, but power, a declaration of justice that could not be ignored. Eric stood there, so angry that his hands clenched into fists, his fingers trembling. The feeling of helplessness and defeat was about to rise in his heart, but he couldn't show it. His eyes were bewildered, his mouth slightly open, but he couldn't utter a word strong enough to protest. The truth was gradually coming clear before his eyes, and he knew that what he had done could not be simply ignored like the previous times. The gazes of the passengers around here were like sharp blades focused on him, not only bringing criticism, but also an undeniable truth. The entire cabin was like a court, where all the evidence was against Eric, and no one could turn their backs on this justice. Anger rose within Eric, but he could not act. His anger was not something he could freely express. He trembled. Not because he feared Tyler, but because he realized that his actions were no longer his own, but a wound to this community. Every word Tyler spoke, every movement she made was a reminder of the price of injustice he had caused, and Eric could not escape the cold, unyielding gazes of those around him. The passengers had stood up, had shared their truths, and now they were looking at him, waiting for an answer. But perhaps the only answer Eric could offer was the silence of someone who could no longer hide his weakness. All eyes from the passengers were on Eric. They no longer seeing him as an ordinary passenger, but as a symbol of injustice. In that moment, everyone realized that a change was taking place before their eyes. The minutes of waiting seemed to last forever, the tension spreading through every little detail, from the rapid breathing of the people sitting nearby to the cold gazes that they could not hide. And when the cabin door suddenly opened, a few security guards entered. Not a word, just their cold appearance was a clear sign that the situation had gone beyond Eric's control. Tyler stood firmly in the middle of the aisle, unmoved by everything that was happening. She didn't need to say anything more, because her every move said it all. Every step the security guards took was a sign of justice that could not be forgotten. The air remained heavy with silence. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something they knew would come. Eric, now, was no longer the one in control. He became the one being observed, condemned without being able to escape. The surrounding passengers all turned to look at each other, their eyes no longer filled with curiosity or anticipation, but with sympathy, with respect for Tyler. These passengers stood up not only to speak the truth, but also to affirm that justice would not be trampled. A woman from the last row stood up quietly, holding the hand of the person next to her, looking at Eric with determination. She didn't need to say anything, because her eyes conveyed everything. The passenger sitting next to her also nodded slightly, and a feeling of solidarity began to spread throughout the cabin. Each person felt like part of a larger whole, where injustice had no place. Eric, accustomed to his complacency, could no longer turn back or protest. The security guards approached him, without warning, just an inevitable intervention. When they asked him to leave the plane, it was not because of his mistake, but because he had crossed the line of mutual respect. The passengers looked on. There was no applause, no jeers. There was only the silence of justice being served, and they knew that what had happened today would become an unforgettable memory. Tyler stood there, saying nothing more, needing nothing more. She had done all she could to protect Marcus and send a clear message of justice. A strange sense of peace filled the air, as if not just one person had won, but an entire community had stood together against injustice, affirming that no one could abuse their power without paying the price. In that moment, as Eric was taken outside and all eyes were on her, Tyler realized that lives can change in a moment. Not through big words or loud actions, but through what we are willing to do in the face of injustice. She was no longer just a flight attendant. She became part of something bigger, a small but meaningful change. The day after the plane landed, when the dust had settled, Tyler received an envelope. She recognized it as a small letter from Marcus's mother. She must have written as soon as she could, not to thank him, but to convey something more. Tyler opened the letter, feeling each word as a deep encouragement. "Thank you for protecting my son. What you did was not only protect but change Marcus's life." The simple thank you made Tyler choke up, and a warm feeling spread through her. What she wrote was not just gratitude, but an affirmation that Tyler's actions had made a profound impact. Not only would Marcus be protected from further harm, but his life would also be transformed, one in which he would not have to endure the injustices he had faced. Tyler put the letter down, feeling like everything she had done that day had not been in vain. She was no longer just a bystander, no longer just an observer, but someone who could make a difference, even if it was just for a moment. And in that moment, she realized that big change didn't have to come from big actions, but could come from standing firm and standing up for what was right. She smiled softly, feeling a new realization. Doing the right thing wasn't a big deal, but when it made a difference in someone's life, it could create a ripple effect that was stronger than ever. That change, from this day forward, would follow Tyler as a reminder that she could make a difference, and that in difficult times, one person's determination could make a big difference. Tyler stood in the break room, the pale afternoon light streaming through the windows, illuminating her face with a faint but thoughtful light that highlighted her thoughtful eyes. The shock of Marcus's mother's letter was still fresh in her mind, but now, what she felt was more than gratitude or relief. It had been a long time since that moment, but the words in the letter had changed her. Tyler was not just Marcus's protector. She realized that what she had done that day, an act of courage and determination, was not simply defending an individual, but standing up for something greater, for the values we all have the right to acknowledge and hold: justice and equality. These moments, however small and fleeting, illuminate a reality that is not always easy to see. Tyler now understands more clearly than ever that justice is not something that only a few can achieve, but a right that belongs to all of us. It is not about recognition or honor, but about standing firm in the values we believe in, no matter the challenge. In that moment, Tyler not only changed Marcus's life, but she changed her own. She realized that an individual can make an impact, whether in a small or large situation, when they choose not to compromise with wrongdoing. This story does not end with loud applause or moments of glory, but with a gentle silence. The silence of those who witnessed, of those who stood up when necessary, of a world where every individual can contribute to the defense of justice. Change sometimes does not come from noise, but from quiet but meaningful actions, like gentle raindrops that can change a whole field. Tyler looked up, smiling to herself, not in admiration, but because she knew, in that moment, that she had done the right thing. And in that silence, everything changed.